Within days of the death of Thomas Hardy in 1928, the executors of his estate made a bonfire of his letters and notebooks at his Dorchester home. Only 12 notebooks survived the blaze. 11 were literary sources, but the 12th was a unique facts notebook and is about to be published for the first time. The Facts Notebook provides an extraordinary insight into how an outwardly genteel Victorian writer came to understand the passions of a darker, rougher age than his own. It also offers clues about the private life of a man who did his damnedest to keep that life a closely guarded secret. Previously neglected or ignored, the Facts Notebook and its sources have been recently unearthed by Hardy scholar Dr. Bill Greenslade, and he's the editor of its very first published edition.
Here I was in the Dorset County Museum, holding the book for the very first time, aware of how substantial a notebook it is. It runs, after all, to 220 pages, and within a very short space of time, you could see the significance and the importance of this notebook in Hardy's beautiful hand. But the crucial point, I think, about the timing of this is that it marks a reshaping of Hardy's imaginative and fictional world. I think it was very significant in relation to the move to Dorchester that he made with Emma in the summer of 1883.
At first, Hardy's marriage to Emma Gifford had been idyllically happy, and when the architect-turned-novelist returned from London to his native Dorset, she shared his rediscovery of the landscapes he'd known since childhood. Hardy respected Emma's judgment then, and she had an important role in the writing of the Facts Notebook. Some of Hardy's research was undertaken at the Dorset County Museum, near the couple's new home in Dorchester.
Within 6 months of beginning the notebook, he goes to the Dorset County Chronicle, the files for 1826, and works through 27, 28, 29, over a very intensive period of about 3.5 months. And in that time, he records a culture wholly different from that of the mid-Victorian age in which he grew up and in which he'd made his name as a novelist. He began copying notes from the local newspaper into the notebook. It was an enterprise deeply associated with his recovery of what he knew to be a rural past. This was a way of confirming a world that he'd heard about and knew about from his family and his family's friends.
Hardy had been born and brought up in a cottage in Upper Bockhampton. Thomas Hardy Sr. had taught him the fiddle, and now that he was back in nearby Dorchester, he visited his parents regularly, relishing their stories of a childhood and youth in a more turbulent Dorset past.
Hardy wanted corroboration of a world that, in a sense, he already knew and had known for years.
I thought he looked very kind, he was smiling, he was relaxed, a great big forehead I thought he had, and very, very kind eyes.
97-year-old Norrie Woodall is one of the few people still alive who met Hardy. When she was young, she acted for him in an adaptation of one of his own novels.
He actually called me to him at the end, and he said, "I haven't given Liza Lou much to say, have I?" And he asked for my script, in which was written, "Oh, Tess, Tess, that's all I have to say." And he took up a pen and he wrote, "I'm so glad you've come home." And then he looked at me and said, "That's better, isn't it?" Oh, he was lovely, he really was. I think he painted the people as he saw them, as they were then.
The novels of the young Hardy sometimes evoke a picture of romantic rural harmony. But his facts notebook research helped to move him in a different direction. Fred Reed, a historian specialising in the 19th century, believes Hardy had a particular reason for concentrating on the early part of that century.
By this time, he's very familiar with the Dorset County Chronicle of the 1850s and 60s. After all, he must have grown up reading that. But he's not going to be familiar at all with the Dorset County Chronicle of the 1820s and 1830s, and he wants to know about the revolutionary period in England. In the 1880s, he's looking back to this revolutionary period in England and finding out how it was then and comparing it with the revolutionary tendencies in his own time.
It represented, I think, a turning point in Hardy's literary career. It gave access to a world upon which Hardy drew material which was remote, really, from that of the society in which he was growing up and in which he had made his name. A primitive, rough society, a relatively lawless one, a society before the advent of the magistrates' court, the police force. This unregulated, primitive culture, a culture ruled by custom rather than by law, occupies a formidable place in this notebook. And of course, it was the striking episodes of the wife sales that form the basis of an episode of The Mayor of Casterbridge, which was, as it were, the tip of an iceberg.
Sale of wife at Stamford.
The news items about husbands who sell their wives, which Hardy had uncovered in his research, are finally transformed into the dramatic opening chapter of his novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. Hardy wrote it in 1886, some 60 years after the newspaper stories on which it's based.
The sailor hesitated a moment, looked anew at the woman, came in, unfolded 5 crisp pieces of paper, and threw them down upon the tablecloth. They were Bank of England notes for £5. Upon the face of it, he chinked down the shillings severally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Up to this moment, it could not positively be asserted that the man, in spite of his tantalizing declaration, was in earnest, but with the demand and response of real cash, the jolly frivolity of the scene departed. A lurid colour seemed to fill the place and change the aspect of all therein. The mirth wrinkles left the listeners' faces, and they waited with parting lips.
Very well. She shall have the child, and the bargain's complete,
said the trusser. He took the sailor's notes and deliberately folded them and put them in a high, remote pocket with an air of finality. The sailor looked at the woman and smiled. She paused for an instant with a close glance at him. Then, dropping her eyes again and saying nothing, she took up the child and followed him as he made towards the door. On reaching it, she turned and, pulling off her wedding ring, flung it across the booth in the hay-trusser's face.
It's a world where men and women make up their own rules of justice, a world dominated by economic privation and social exclusion and the privations of an immensely harsh post-Napoleonic War class system. Dorset was amongst the poorest counties, and there's something of this world that Hardy is able to capture in the notebook.
Although Hardy's grandparents had known desperate poverty, his success as a novelist was now enabling him to climb the social ladder. On the outskirts of Dorchester, he built his own home, Max Gate. It seems that he was allowed to borrow bound volumes of the Dorset County Chronicle in order that he could take notes from them at his home. Initially, Emma had helped him in his note-taking, but he increasingly preferred to work on his own.
There's an example here of an item which Emma enters over 5 or 6 pages involving a lawsuit of a relative of the Duke of Wellington, which Emma copies, and then Hardy takes over, and you can see a clear distinction here between the two hands. After 6 or 7 pages, it may well have been, that Emma decided she may well have had enough, and Hardy rescued her and continued the item to the end.
Hardy's Facts Notebook concentrates on newspaper stories from 1826 to 1830, a harsh time in Dorset history when the county suffered a severe economic downturn and was seething with discontent.
Spirit of discontent. Incendiarism at its climax. Execution of the Ken incendiaries.
The Dorset discontent was savagely suppressed, and at Ken, the 3 men who had set fire to hayricks were publicly hanged.
There's a good deal here about crime, but he is particularly struck by incidents which note a degree of social injustice.
Hardy's attention to social injustice is of particular interest to historian Fred Reid.
You're not seeing the real Dorset, the muck, the low wages, the bad labour conditions, so on. They're not in the forefront of the novel. The interesting thing is that Hardy tries in his first novel to bring class consciousness and class tension before the reader directly. It was the poor man and the lady. We don't have a text of it, it's lost. But he himself called it a socialistic novel. And when that was read by the publisher's reader, it was John Morley who was the publisher's reader, and Morley commented, "Thackeray meant fun, this writer means mischief." And so Hardy decided after that, he was terribly hurt at the rejection, he said, "I'll have to put my satire in edgeways." I think that says it all, really.
But Hardy did include in notebook and novel references to the brutal measures taken to control rick burning and poaching. Amongst these were the use of spring guns or man-traps, devices which sometimes caught innocent victims or even those who'd set them. They became the basis of a key moment in his novel The Woodlanders. Agricultural labourer Tim Tangs bears a grudge against a philandering local doctor and plans a savage revenge.
Tim Tangs turned about and ran down the opposite side of the hill till he was again at the head of his own garden. It was the work of a few moments to drag out the man-trap very gently, that the plate might not be disturbed sufficiently to throw it, to a space between a pair of young oaks, and being backed up by bushes, left this as the only course for a foot passenger. In it he laid the trap with the same gentleness of handling, locked the chain around one of the trees, and finally slid back the guard which was placed to keep the gin from accidentally catching the arms of him who set it. Having completed these arrangements, Tim sprang through the adjoining hedge of his father's garden, ran down the path, and softly entered the house. As soon as he'd bolted the door, Tim unlaced and kicked off his boots at the foot of the stairs and retired without lighting a candle. Before, however, he had completed the operation, a long cry responded without, penetrating but indescribable. The man-trap was thrown, and between its jaws was part of a woman's clothing, a patterned silk skirt, gripped with such violence that the iron teeth had passed through it, skewering its tissue in a score of places.
This was, after all, a lethal object. Such man-traps, though, were used probably down to the 1830s and 1840s, And by the time that Hardy's readership were aware of them through the pages of The Woodlanders, published in 1887, they were seen as obsolete items, relics of a barbaric age. It's an act of personal revenge, but it's also an act of class revenge. And in that respect, Hardy is distilling and repossessing that rough sense of an instrument of class oppression that was available through the pages of the newspaper and mediated through the sensational plotting of this late novel.
In 1887, Hardy began the first draft of what was to become one of the best-loved novels in the English language. Though set in magnificent Wessex landscapes, Tess of the D'Urbervilles made no concession to romantic ideas about the pastoral life. Tess lived in the harsh world, which Hardy continued to research meticulously.
I think one of the striking things for readers and scholars of Hardy is the extent to which he transforms a bald newspaper item in the public domain into an element of imaginative creation. And an example would be the way that he incorporates one of several coach accidents that he copies into the notebook. From 1830, there's an example here, an item headed "Dark Night, shaft of wagon enters breast of ridden horse."
A sudden jerk shook her in her seat, and Tess awoke from the sleep into which she had fallen. A hollow groan, unlike anything she had heard in her life, came from the front, followed by a shout of "Hi there!" The lantern hanging at her wagon had gone out, but another was shining in her face, much brighter than her own had been. Something terrible had happened. In consternation, Tess jumped down and discovered the dreadful truth. The groan had proceeded from her father's poor horse, Prince. The pointed shaft of the cart had entered the breast of the unhappy prince like a sword, and from the wound his life's blood was spouting in a stream and falling with a hiss into the road. In her despair, Tess sprang forward and put her hand upon the hole, with the only result that she became splashed from face to skirt with the crimson drops.
The point about these incidents, though, is that they matter in a precarious rural economy. It is, after all, the death of the horse Prince which forces the D'Urbervilles to look elsewhere for their economic livelihood, and therefore implicates Tess on her road to ruin. And so Hardy transforms a bald account from a local newspaper into a polished and beautifully written and deeply symbolic moment in one of his greatest novels.
The things that he's really interested in, like gender relations, like the destruction of the peasantry, the squeezing out of the lifeholders and so on, things that he's really interested in, he finds ways of getting these into the novels that say everything that he needs to say. And what's interesting is that quite a lot of his readers in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s understood this perfectly well. You keep tripping across reviews of Hardy's fiction in socialist and radical journals in the 1890s and early 1900s. There's a review of Tessa d'Urbervilles, for instance, in Keir Hardy's Labour Leader around about 1912. So there were readers out there who could read, what was actually going on.
But by now, Emma was growing increasingly unhappy about the direction which her husband's novels were taking. A committed Anglican, she was becoming more devout as Hardy's scepticism grew. He'd begun work on Jude the Obscure, a work in which the religious doubts of the central character would find uncompromising expression.
Oh yes, Dorchester was very much religious, And that was partly why they didn't like Hardy. I'm sure of that. You see, he was agnostic, wasn't he? Well, I mean, so am I, but... But, I mean, he upset the church people a lot. Oh, yes. That would be partly the trouble. Because Dorchester then, of a Sunday, you would hear the church bells ring out up till 11, and then there was dead silence. Nobody walked in the streets, there was no traffic. You could even hear the birds sing.
Hardy was now turning his back on Orthodox religion.
Comradeship, kindly feeling, these are all words that Hardy uses, by the way, in his fiction, have to come into operation. And if we can only learn to work like that, then there's a good chance that we can stay afloat. It seems to me that that's the message that's coming across.
Hardy's message was now a long way from conventional Victorian morality.
What is perfectly clear is that the notebook is more than usually full of incidents involving sudden marriages, abductions, elopements, actions which are unfamiliar and strange and unconventional.
Young man puts up at public house for a night. He sees woman who took his fancy. Licence obtained, married next morning. All in his day's work. Young man in church renovating monument. Comes down ladder and marries young woman.
One might even go so far as to say that Hardy himself, suffering from a prolonged absence of love in his own marriage, may well have been displacing certain emotions in respect of these incidents. And of course, in Jude, there is a pattern of marriage and of divorce and of remarriage. There's a kind of recursiveness in the presentation of the theme of marriage, involving all the major characters, Sue, Arabella, and Jude.
Arabella ascended the stairs, softly opened the door of the first bedroom, and peeped in. Finding that her shorn Samson was asleep, she entered to the bedside and stood regarding him. The fevered flush on his face from the debauch of the previous evening lessened the fragility of his ordinary appearance. His long lashes, dark brows, and curly black hair against the white pillow completed the physiognomy of one whom Arabella, as a woman of rank passions, still felt it worth to recapture, highly important to recapture, as a woman straitened both in means and in reputation. Her ardent gaze seemed to affect him. His quick breathing became suspended, and he opened his eyes.
Many readers of Jude the Obscure reacted with outrage. The Bishop of Wakefield announced he'd thrown such garbage onto his fire.
I wouldn't look to Hardy to say this is what gender relations were like in, say, the middle classes or the nobility in the 19th century, but he's certainly picking up on accounts from newspapers, from stories that people tell him and so on, of how gender relations can be cramped and crooked and distorted by social convention and misfortune and so forth. All the way through, he's undermining ideas of social privilege, either in class terms or gender terms, and he's saying, these privileges and these sufferings arise because we carry all this false baggage around with us in our heads.
Retreating to his Maxgate fortress, Hardy withstood the critical onslaught on Jude with as much stoicism as he could muster. But it took its toll on his marriage.
It's fairly clear that by the early 1890s, Thomas Hardy's relationship with Emma was in some difficulty. And this can be shown very graphically here at Max Gate, when Emma decided, after the publication of Jude the Obscure, to have built here her own attic room, partly also in response to Emma's disappointment at the novel's outspokenness, that she decided that from now on she wanted to live a more separate life. And at the same time, Thomas decided to have his own dedicated study space here at Max Gate. It was a graphic illustration of the marital parting of the ways.
After Jude the Obscure, Hardy never wrote another novel. Soon afterwards, he began the process of destroying the evidence of his past, long before his executors continued the task he imposed on them.
This was not the end for Hardy, for within a few years he turned his pain into poetry of astonishing creative force, poetry that still resonates in our own day.
They hail me as one living, but don't they know that I have died of late years, untombed although? And when my love's heart kindled in hate of me, wherefore I knew not, died I one more degree. And if when I died fully, I cannot say, and changed into the corpse thing I am today, yet is it that though whiling the time somehow, in walking, talking, smiling, I live not now.
Had it not been for disagreements between Hardy's executors, the Facts Notebook would have been ashes, and crucial hints about his literary and personal journey would have been lost. Whilst Hardy attempted to ensure the destruction of the factual inspiration to his novels, he wrote poetry that was always totally honest. In The Dead Man Walking, he'd intended to convey his feeling of desolation and defeat. In reality, it signifies a remarkable regeneration. The major novelist would also be remembered as a major poet.
Thomas Hardy's tragic tale, The Mayor of Casterbridge. Listen to a dramatisation on BBC Sounds.